Sean Diddy Combs has just filed a brand new bid to get out of jail before his sentencing in a few months. From arguing he shouldn't be locked up for his swinger lifestyle, to highlighting the atrocious conditions at the MDC, to addressing allegations of violence, he is fighting for his life in this new letter to the judge.
The fluorescent lights in the prison flickered faintly overhead, casting a pale, sickly glow across the concrete walls. The air was heavy with the stale scent of disinfectant and something far less clean, the lingering metallic tang of tension that never seemed to leave this place.
Be released from jail. I know I've asked that question before so many different times here on Sidebar, but we have right now a brand new request from his legal team, a brand new filing from his defense team arguing for why he should be released now after that monumental verdict in his criminal case several weeks ago. Circumstances have changed, and I will tell you what, we did an interview a few weeks back that kind of previewed why and how Combs could be released. It was a bail bondsman that is apparently working with Diddy's team behind the scenes. I'm going to get to that a little bit later, but what I want to talk about right now is this latest letter from the defense to the judge overseeing this case, Judge Arun Subramanian. Remember, this comes after a jury of Combs' peers found him not guilty of racketeering conspiracy, not guilty of 2 counts of sex trafficking, but they did convict him of 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. He's set to be sentenced on October 3rd. Technically, he could face up to 10 years in prison on each charge. Highly unlikely. Think maybe you might be looking at somewhere to 2 to 5 years potentially, but he could also get time served and be released, although that also seems unlikely. I'll talk about that a little bit later too. But initially, after the verdict, right after the verdict, his defense team petitioned the court that he should be released. He was just acquitted of some very serious charges. The judge denied it. The judge denied Combs bail once again. And remember, this comes after he was rejected bail multiple times since he was arrested back in September of 2024, highlighting the severity of the charges, the violence, and so forth. But now, this is different. Now, what is the defense arguing? I'm going to go over all this in the new letter. I'm going to give my take at the end about whether or not it's going to be successful and whether or not he will actually be released before sentencing in October. So, the defense begins by arguing that Sean Combs should be released in advance of sentencing, and the court has the power to do this. They have the authority, among other things, because you can clearly show, quote, that there are exceptional reasons why such person's detention would not be appropriate. So, what are those exceptions? What are those reasons? What are those circumstances that are exceptional? They highlight several things that we're going to get into. That the charges he was convicted of, we're going to call them the Mann Act violations, that's what it's called under the law. They're not as severe, they're not as egregious as other convictions in other cases. That the sheer fact that he's locked up at the MDC, the Metropolitan Detention Center, for the past 11 months, that in and of itself is a reason for him to be released. These are all exceptional circumstances, and I'm going to get into all the arguments. But first, they highlight the standard. And they argue that to be released under federal law, you need to show 2 conditions. First, the district court must find by clear and convincing evidence that the person is not likely to flee or pose a danger to the safety of any other person or the community if released. Second, it must be clearly shown that there are exceptional reasons why such person's detention would not be appropriate. Now, clear and convincing evidence is a lower standard. By the way, it's not like beyond a reasonable doubt. Anyway, basically, you have to show he's not a flight risk, he's not a danger, and you have to show there are particular, exceptional, unique reasons for why detaining Combs is wrong. We're going to start with the exceptional reasons justifying his release. And they begin by trying to define, well, what exactly is exceptional circumstances? What does that mean? And they argue that case law suggests a court has a lot of discretion.
Inmates moved in small, cautious patterns in the common area, some hunched over tables playing cards, others pacing in quiet conversation, their eyes darting every so often toward the far end of the room. There was an unspoken hum in the air, the kind that precedes a storm. Sean Diddy Combs was there too, seated at one of the steel tables, his back to the wall, a habit he had developed since the day he entered this place. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't chatting. He wasn't even making eye contact with anyone. Instead, his gaze was fixed downward, hands folded, shoulders hunched just slightly, a man trying to exist in the space without being swallowed by it. To most inmates, he was still the celebrity, the one whose name had been shouted from stages, whose face had been splashed across glossy magazine covers. But here, the glamour was gone. The walls didn't care who you were. Neither did the men inside them. For days, whispers had been moving through the cell blocks.
When Jane and Combs watched pornography together, Jane testified that she contacted 2 different porn stars and invited them to join her and Mr. Combs. Both Miss Ventura and Jane testified that very often they would see the same men over and over again for years. In July of 2024, Jane testified, for instance, that she suggested to Mr. Combs that they call Paul. Jane explained that she told Combs she, quote, missed Paul. When asked why she said that, she responded, because I did. This was a lifestyle, one that both Miss Ventura and Jane chose, one they all, as grown adults, had a right to choose. Like many aspects of sex and intimacy, it was not without its complications, its bouts of jealousy, and at times, its frustrations. But that is a hallmark of any serious romantic relationship, and that is what these were, serious, long-term romantic relationships. By the way, not surprising they're really focusing on this because, again, he was acquitted of sex trafficking. They highlight how the jury didn't find sex trafficking of Jane or Cassie, that it didn't occur. There was no force, fraud, or coercion that was used to induce these women to engage in commercial sex acts. For transportation to engage in prostitution, what he was convicted of, the prosecution didn't have to prove that violence was used or that fraud was used or threats were used. It was just, did you transport these women and men for the purposes of sex work, commercial sex acts? And obviously the jury convicted him of that. And they highlight all the jury found was that there was prostitution, payment of porn stars and escorts. And they highlight that he is a swinger, or under the Mann Act, a John. And they argue he doesn't deserve to be locked up for this. Quote, Sean Combs should not be in jail for this conduct. In fact, he may be the only person currently in a United States jail for being any sort of John, and certainly the only person in jail for hiring adult male escorts for him and his girlfriend when he did not even have sex with the escort himself. Over the last 75 years, the White Slave Traffic Act has been limited to defendants who cause interstate travel for financial gain through the business of prostitution. That Sean Combs remains in jail for being convicted of being a customer of consensual adult sex services makes this case truly exceptional. Not only is prosecuting the users of adult prostitution services inconsistent with the Mann Act, it's inconsistent with the prosecution policies of the district attorneys of Manhattan and the city attorney of Los Angeles, California, 2 of the 3 locations where this prostitution allegedly took place. In addition, Mr. Combs is incarcerated while everyone else involved in this identical conduct, his girlfriends, the cowboys, the agency leaders, the porn stars, and others, walk free, as they should. If there was ever a fact pattern that was exceptional under the Mann Act, it is this one. And then they move on to another argument, that the Department of Justice, the DOJ, has usually only charged Mann Act violations when there's financial gain. And they even cite a number of cases in the Southern District of New York, where Combs was prosecuted, that apparently involved defendants that set up a prostitution business for profit. Again, trying to distinguish between Combs' conduct and these cases. He never did any of this for profit, they argued. And they even cite the 1953 U.S. Attorney's Manual that says, quote, as a general rule,
loud enough to be overheard by guards, but constant enough to be noticed by anyone paying attention. Words about testing him, about sending a message. In a place where respect is currency and reputation is armor, someone like Diddy could not remain untouched forever. Every man here had something to prove, and a high-profile inmate was as much a target as he was a trophy. The morning started like any other, the sharp blare of the wake-up bell, the shuffle of bodies lining up for breakfast, the clank of trays and the murmur of voices. But there was something different in the way people looked at him. Some stares lingered a fraction too long. Some conversations stopped abruptly when he passed. He felt it, even if no one spoke it aloud. And when he made his way to the common area after the meal, the air seemed tighter, like the room was holding its breath. It happened fast. Too fast for him to react, too fast for the guards to stop. One moment, he was sitting there, hands resting on the table. The next, a shadow loomed over him, and before he could rise, the first blow landed, a hard, bone-rattling strike to the side of his head. The sound was sharp, a dull thud followed by the scrape of the table as it shifted under the impact. Gasps erupted from nearby inmates, but no one stepped in. In prison, you don't interfere unless you want to be pulled into the storm yourself. The attacker didn't hesitate.
Prosecution should not be instituted in the so-called non-commercial cases. And they claim the Department of Justice manual today, quote, makes clear that the prosecution of customers involved in an 18 U.S.C. 2421 offense, like Mr. Combs here, is now limited to prosecuting those who engage in commercial sex with victims of sex trafficking, in addition to those who otherwise perpetrate or facilitate human trafficking offenses. And in the absence of any sex trafficking charge, however, it is clear that the standalone Mann Act counts never would have been prosecuted. That seems true. I think you ask any legal expert, they will say if all the government had against Sean Combs was the transportation to engage in prostitution charges, just the prostitution charges, they probably wouldn't have gone after him. They coupled it with racketeering and they coupled it with sex trafficking. I agree with that. I don't think that they would have gone after him just for that. Anyway, the defense highlights how modern day prosecutions of Johns is really when you're talking about exploiting vulnerable foreigners who don't speak English well, which again is not the case here. And they highlight how the only potentially comparable case in New York is where you had a retired police officer and a former judge who apparently hired women to have sex with a male fraternal group called the Jesters. But Combs' attorneys say, while there was no profit there, there's no profit here, there was sex trafficking of those prostitutes. That's what's different. Again, Combs was acquitted of sex trafficking in this case. And here's the main point, quote, moreover, the cases which involve defendants similarly situated to Mr. Combs have been released on bond pending sentencing. In reviewing the cases across the country where the primary or sole conviction was for a violation of 18 U.S.C. 2421, the defendants who were not charged with running a prostitution business have been released pending sentencing. And then Combs' attorneys make another argument for why Combs' conditions are exceptional. And it's about him being locked up at the MDC. They say that a district court judge in the Southern District in another case basically said how bad the MDC is. As Judge Furman noted, the state of affairs at MDC is unacceptable. In so noting, Judge Furman concluded that the conditions in the MDC qualify as exceptional reasons under the statute justifying, and this was the defendant in this case, Chavez's continuing release. Judge Furman found that the conditions at the MDC are, quote, dreadful in many respects, but three warrant particular emphasis. 1. Continued reports of inordinate periods of lockdown. 2. Claims that the facility provides inadequate and or substantially delayed necessary medical care, a particular risk in this case. And 3. General issues about the conditions at the facility. These conditions have not abated in Mr. Combs' detention at the facility. As the court is aware, during Mr. Combs' incarceration at the MDC, the facility was subject to an interagency sweep that was designed to achieve our shared goal of maintaining a safe environment for both our employees and the incarcerated individuals housed at MDC Brooklyn. They're actually quoting.
Following with another hit, this one to his jaw, snapping his head to the side. The world tilted, sounds blurring into a muffled roar. His hand shot up, trying to shield himself, but another blow came, this time to his ribs, forcing the air from his lungs in a pained grunt. The guards moved quickly, but quickly is a relative term in a place like this. By the time they reached him, the damage was done. They yanked the attacker back, shouting commands, while another guard grabbed Diddy by the arm, pulling him up from the floor. His knees buckled under him for a second before he steadied, one hand instinctively going to his side where the pain was sharpest. The room erupted into noise, inmates yelling, some taunting, others calling out in surprise. The guards barked orders, forcing everyone back, creating a path to the exit. The attacker was already being dragged in the opposite direction, his expression unreadable, like a man who had accomplished exactly what he set out to do. As Diddy was escorted out, his eyes flicked around the room, scanning the faces. Some were smirking. Some were blank. But more than a few were.
So unless I ask about specific behaviors, I might not get the answer that I thought I was getting, or I was misinterpreting that. And so, children do think of things as normal in their family. And so other adults who are not involved in that situation might look at it and go, this is abusive. This is exploitive of children for them to be exposed to that. But for that child, this is normal. This is a normal Saturday night. This is what I grew up seeing and being exposed to.
And I know when the lawsuits had first started coming out against Sean Diddy Combs, a lot of people were kind of wondering, how did Diddy become this way or get this way? Obviously there's also, that power dynamic that we could also kind of attribute to the allegations that have been made against him as well too. But do you also think that being exposed to sex and at this very young age, during a very developmental time in his life, do you think this may have attributed to kind of his thoughts and thinking about sex, in terms of, maybe in his mind, maybe he thinks that women or men are just objects, and that, sex is just possibly transactional, that type of thing. But what do you think this exposure kind of did to him? Do you think that kind of attributed to him becoming the way he did?
I think there are two really interesting parts of that. One is our early exposure to sex, both in terms of what we're taught as well as what we experience, certainly shapes our understanding of sex, our understanding of the context of how sex is supposed to be, what kind of relationship it's likely to involve, and those kinds of things. If we witness a parent having sex casually, then we start thinking this is how you have sex. But I think another question that we just can't ignore is the fact as a role of power. Because one question is, how does somebody become the way they are? And then another question is, how are they allowed to stay the way that they are? And I think that also speaks to this kind of, lack of accountability or lack of consequences for individuals who begin to abuse power and begin to abuse people. And I think that in many respects is as big of an issue here as anything.
Now, let's just say these allegations or these claims are true about Diddy's mom, for instance. What do you think as far as kind of translating, or not translating, that's probably the wrong word, but kind of seeing that pattern repeat itself when it comes to Diddy's own children? I'm specifically talking about his sons here, where, they have faced their own kind of legal issues as well to Diddy's sons. But do you think it's a far stretch to think that Diddy also exposed his own sons to this at a young age?
There is so much literature and research that talks about this kind of multi-generational passing of not just trauma, but just ideas of what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what is acceptable behavior within this family, what is not acceptable behavior. Again, for one family, you take responsibility for your behavior. For another family, it's don't get caught. So I think when we look at families, there's a reason why we see
Watching him with a calculating gaze, the kind that measures a man after he's been knocked down. In here, weakness, or even the perception of it, can be more dangerous than any punch. The walk to the infirmary was silent except for the echo of boots against the floor. Every step sent a dull ache radiating from his ribs, and there was a faint ringing in his ears from the blow to his head. His jaw throbbed. The guards didn't speak to him, and he didn't speak to them. In the infirmary, a medic shined a light into his eyes, checked for signs of concussion, and wrapped his ribs with practiced efficiency. A cut on his cheek was cleaned and taped. The entire time, Diddy sat still, breathing slow and shallow, his mind turning over the reality of what had just happened. This wasn't some random flare-up. It didn't feel like a spur-of-the-moment burst of anger. No, this felt deliberate. Inside these walls, nothing is forgotten. Word travels faster than in any city outside. And when someone takes a shot at you, whether they succeed or not, it changes your standing instantly. He knew this. He'd seen it happen to others. Now it was happening to him. By the time the medic finished, the warden himself had arrived, his expression set in that neutral, unreadable mask that comes with years of dealing with men who live by their own.
The declaration reads, Supervisor 2 informed Supervisor 1 that the sweep of the west side of the MDC was taking longer than expected, and it was unclear whether the east side of the MDC would be searched. Supervisor 1 informed Supervisor 2 that in her view, the MDC sweep should include the east side of the MDC as planned, in part because of what the prosecution team had learned regarding the defendant's conduct at the MDC. At the request of Supervisor 2, Supervisor 1 conferred with USAO SDNY senior leadership about the search of the east side of the jail. This conversation included, in substance, that the sweep was taking longer than expected and did not include discussion of the defendant. Thereafter, Supervisor 1 relayed to Supervisor 2 that the position of the USAO SDNY was that the MDC sweep should stick to the original plan to search the entire jail. Supervisor 2 relayed to other personnel present at the MDC, in substance, that the sweep of Unit 1 should proceed as planned. Now, I want you to pay very careful attention to that because that's something that the defense is going to seize on, that they were directing the Bureau of Prisons on who to search. Okay. AUSA Slavic continues. On or about November 3rd, 2024, following the completion of the MDC sweep, the prosecution team first became aware of Investigator 1's involvement in the MDC sweep through a phone call between myself and Investigator 1. Investigator 1 informed me that he had spent time in the defendant's unit and checked the defendant's bunk area for contraband, including cell phones. Investigator 1 also informed me that he took photographs of certain of the defendant's papers and an address book. Investigator 1 provided a high-level overview of the contents of the BOP notes, including the defendant's plans to discredit possible witnesses and find dirt on people. At the conclusion of the November 3rd, 2023 call, I requested that Investigator 1 send the BOP notes directly to the AUSA leading the filter team, i.e., the team charged with reviewing material that may contain attorney communications or work product. We've talked about this before, but a filter team is not the prosecutors in this case. This is a separate third-party team, goes through the communication, sees what might be privileged and what can and can't be turned over to the prosecutors. So again, the investigator's sworn statement was filed under seal, so we can't see exactly what was said, but the defense team can. And they hit back with a filing of their own, and they have been calling out the prosecution for parts of the declaration that they called, quote, remarkably vague. And they say, actually, the U.S. Attorney's Office is proving the defense's point. Combs' defense writes, quote, the declarations show that ever since the government first tried to use Mr. Combs' privilege notes to continue his detention, it has presented a materially false narrative about how it got access to these sensitive privileged materials containing his defense strategy and communications with his attorneys. Most significantly, the declarations reveal SDNY supervisors directed the BOP to search Mr. Combs' unit because of its investigation and prosecution of Mr. Combs. And they demonstrate the government has consistently monitored Mr. Combs' legal calls. In other words, they confirm what Mr. Combs has been arguing all along, that the search was conducted based upon a pretext, not for any legitimate penological reason, and that Investigator 1's surveillance before and during the search violated Mr. Combs' constitutional rights and invaded the attorney-client privilege. They go on to say, the declarations expose that after the sweep began, it was unclear whether Mr. Combs' unit would be searched at all. Moreover, the search
rules. They spoke briefly, questions about whether Diddy knew his attacker, whether there had been any prior confrontations. Diddy kept his answers short. No, he didn't know him. No, there hadn't been an argument. But inside, his thoughts were moving fast. In a place like this, an attack like that doesn't happen without reason. And if he didn't know the reason yet, it meant someone else was controlling the narrative. Later that day, he was moved, for his safety, the guards said, to a different unit with tighter security. The cell was smaller, the isolation more intense. But even here, word had already spread. Guards and inmates alike glanced at him differently. He could feel it in the way conversations paused when he passed by. In the way certain eyes lingered on him just long enough to send a message. Fear is a dangerous thing in prison. Show too much of it, and you're marked. Show none, and you risk someone trying harder to break you. It's a balance few ever master, and for a man who had built his life on projecting power, this was foreign territory. He was no longer in control. There were no velvet ropes here, no private security to keep danger at bay. That night, lying on the thin mattress in the dim cell, the events replayed in his mind over and over. The sudden shadow. The flash of movement. The impact. the eyes in the room afterward. He could hear the laughter of a few inmates down the hall, low but sharp enough to carry. Whether it was about him or not didn't matter. In here, you always assume it is. The attack was a physical blow, yes, but it was also something more, a message written in fists instead of words. It was a way of saying, you are not untouchable here. It stripped away the illusion that fame could be a shield. And it left him with the knowledge that from this point forward, every step, every word, every glance would be calculated, both by him and by those around him. In the outside world, Sean Combs had been the orchestrator, the one pulling the strings, the one deciding who entered his orbit. In here, he was just another man trying to survive the unspoken rules of a place that didn't care who he had been. And survival meant adapting. It meant watching everything. It meant never turning your back. The scars from this attack would heal, the cut, the bruised ribs, the swelling, but the real wound was deeper. It was the shift in the way the prison saw him, and perhaps more importantly, the way he now saw himself. Because once blood has been drawn in prison, the clock starts ticking. It's not about if something will happen again, it's about when. And as he lay there in the silence, he knew the countdown had already begun.